Ernest Michel. This is terrific. Born in Mannheim, Germany. What year?
Before I answer your question, I have a statement I want to make. Is that permitted?
Absolutely.
Okay.
You've got the mic.
There are 3 events in my life that have shaped me and had a direct influence on who I am today and what I've been doing. One was the day I escaped from the final death march on April 18th, 1945, about a month before the end of the war. The second one was the Nuremberg war crimes trial, where I was sitting not only as a reporter, but also as a survivor to witness the leaders of the German government being brought to justice. The third one was an event that meant a great deal to me. All 3 have shaped me, as I indicated to you. That was, and I had the privilege to organize and then to chair the first and only gathering of all survivors throughout the world who were willing to come to Jerusalem in 1981. 6,000 survivors came from 23 countries and 4 continents for a 4-day celebration of life and Jewish survival. Of those 3, the one that stands out in my mind, and this is why I'm particularly pleased to have accepted your invitation to come here, is my participation at the Nuremberg war crimes trial. And I talk about this tomorrow in more detail, the first time I met a senior leader of the American community, Robert Jackson. And his name was the first name that I knew other than FDR and Eisenhower. Those 2 I knew about during the war. The name Robert Jackson I only heard the day I came to Nuremberg on January 20th, 1945. And what he said, how he said it, how he spoke, has had an effect with me that I still remember today. And now I'll answer your questions.
We hit a home run here. Think about that journey, though. I mean, here is a very young Ernest Michel who is, at the time of the commencement of the Nuremberg trial, you're
22 years old.
23 years old. And you walk into that courtroom for the first time, and you gotta reflect back on, my gosh, 22 years, what a life you had already lived from the beginning of Mannheim and working your way there. So I want to kind of cover that sort of landscape, if you will. Your mom and dad, what were their backgrounds?
Well, I come from a German Jewish family that lived in Germany for over 300 years. My father served in the army during World War I. My grandfather during the French-German War of the 1870s. And we grew up in a normal home until 1933. 33 was when Hitler came to power. And not only did Hitler come to power, but at the same year that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected as the President of the United States. The first time I heard his name was in a movie theater in Mannheim, in the newsreel, when it was announced that Franklin Roosevelt, his name used to be, and the announcer said, Rosenfeld, became the President of the United States. So that was the first time I heard Roosevelt's name, and it was also the year when Hitler came to power.
You did your schooling in Mannheim, and how long were you there in Mannheim?
In 1936, I was 13 years old. I was told by the coach, I played soccer, I loved soccer playing, that I was no longer permitted to be in the soccer team. And I told him, why? What's the matter? I'm a pretty good player. He says, well, as of this week, no Jews can attend school any longer. Not only will you be not allowed to play soccer, but you also will no longer be welcome as a student in the school. So at age 13, my education came to an end, and may I add that I haven't been to school since. Also, I must tell you, being as modest as I am, I have now 2 honorary degrees.
One of your close friends, though, who was on the soccer team, I think you tell the story, one day, I mean, you were playing soccer together, next day, you're off the team and he's part of the Nazi Hitler group.
They both joined, I remember their names, Kurt Hess, and, you know, my memory isn't what it used to be. Two boys, one Catholic, one Protestant, me Jewish, we were inseparable. And the day after I was kicked out of school, they never talked to me again. It was the end of, not only of our friendship, but at the end of the life that I used to be able to lead before the whole thing happened.
So when you come home and you ask your mom and dad about what's going on, this must be rather confusing for you.
Well, it really wasn't, Greg, because I'm a reader. I read German newspapers, I knew what was going on. I heard about the Stürmer, which was a newspaper that Stryker published, anti-Semitic newspaper with the noses and all the crimes that Jews had committed. So I knew what was going on, and I was really, in a way, not surprised. But what did surprise me, what eventually happened later on, because nobody in their right mind could foresee what was going to happen to Jews in Germany.
Kristallnacht, 1938, and that occurred throughout Germany. How did that impact Mannheim?
I was not in Mannheim at that time.
Okay.
My father had arranged for me to get a job at a factory in a town called Pourcel, which was about 20, 30 miles from Mannheim. And I worked there to learn. It was a factory that produced cartons, you know, everybody knows we live on that, you know. So they had a factory in Germany. It was the last Jewish factory that existed in Germany. And I got a job there. I had nothing else to do. I was kicked out of school, so at age, I was out in 37, I was 23. You figured out. 37, 40, 50, thank you very much. I need a little help on that. I worked for the factory, and on November 9th, the German consul in Paris was shot by a man by the name of Herschel Greenspan. Yeah? And he died on, the date was November 8th. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And November 9th, the Gestapo issued an edict to give the SR, the brown shirts, the right to do whatever they want to do, including taking care of synagogues. And that's the night every synagogue in Germany, 1,400 of them, were burned to the ground. 1,400. That was, to me, the beginning. I grew up very fast during that time. That was the beginning of of really what eventually became known as the Holocaust.
Fast forward a little bit from 1938, your life path at that point. your mother, dad, Lottie, your sister?
My sister.
Yeah. Walk me through what happens the next few years.
My father was arrested that night. Our apartment was broken in and just totally torn apart by the brown shirts. My mother was beaten. My grandmother was sitting she's 85 years old at that time, in shock, total shock. She didn't know what happened. I took a train from Pourcel to Mannheim in order to see what happened to my family. It was the last factory that was opened, that was permitted to function. And any Jewish business was totally closed, destroyed. It was really the end. I did not realize at that time that it was very difficult for my father and my mother to put food on the table. He had a cigar factory that was forcibly taken over, didn't get any money for it. My father sold pencils, my mother sold Nivea cream. I mean, today I realize it must have been extremely difficult for them to put food on the table. The one thing I did at that time, and it had a tremendous effect on what happened to me, my father told me I should take some lessons about calligraphy. I said, why should I learn calligraphy at a time? He said, you've got nothing else to do, try to learn something. So I went to learn calligraphy, not realizing what effect this had on my life, but we'll talk about that later on.
Your dad's arrested, and where did he go then?
He was arrested, but because he served in the army, they released him after 2 or 3 days. And he came back to our apartment, and he was a different person. He was a broken man. The apartment was destroyed. The synagogue in Mannheim had gone on in flames, like every synagogue in Germany. And what are we going to do now? That's when I went to Pourcel, and that's where, before then. And that was the last year. From November 10th, 1938, until the war broke out, the only thing I could do to learn calligraphy. That's the only thing I did. And that really, later on, maybe you'll ask me about that, that really saved my life.
At some point, the Nazis start gathering the German Jewish people in the Mannheim area. When did that take place?
World War II broke out on September 1st, 1939. 2 days later, and England and France entered the war. I mean, most of you know about that. And 2 days later, there's a knock on the door. There is an S-man with a Nazi insignia. Ernest Michel, I say, yes. 6 o'clock tomorrow morning at the train station. I said, well, shut up. 6 o'clock tomorrow morning at the train station. My mother was there, my father was there in the back room. And what are you going to do now? I know I have to be there. At 6 o'clock in the morning, my father and mother took me to the train station. It's a walking distance, about 20 minutes. There were about 15, 20 boys my own age. In 1938, I was 15 years old. 1939, I was 16. The last time I saw my parents. They were eventually deported to France, to a concentration camp in France. And the last thing my mother told me bleib ein guter jüdischer Junge. Stay a good Jewish boy. That was the last time I saw my parents. They were eventually deported to France, as I mentioned. And in 1942, they were sent to Drancy, near Paris. And from there, with a train on the cattle cars to Auschwitz, where they were gassed in September 1942.
Your sister had gotten out a little bit earlier?
My sister was able to get out of Mannheim because she was 11 at that time. And we had a cousin living in Strasbourg. And my father took her to the train station, went with her to Karlsruhe, which is across directly from Strasbourg, Alsace-Lorraine, and says, stand next to a man and make it believe that he was his father, her father. And she did that, 11 years old. And she went to France. That was March or April 1939, before the war broke out. Until the war broke out, we were in correspondence with her, or rather my parents were. After that, no more word. Any communication with France came to an end. And I want to tell this ahead of time before you ask me about it. She was kept by Catholic nuns in a convent in France. And in 1943, she was taken across the Pyrenean Mountains to Spain. You all remember the movie The Sound of Music? That's what happened to my sister. On a transport, aided by Spanish soldiers, they were taken and they were paid off. They were taken across the border into Spain, and from Spain, she was sent to what's called then Palestine. I don't want to jump ahead to today. My sister today is the mother of 4 daughters, 15 children, and 16 great-grandchildren. And my oldest granddaughter, because my daughter lives in Israel, 2 weeks ago entered the Israeli army. Every girl has to serve for 2 years, and every man for 3 years. So in a way, this is a positive note, you know, with all the horror and everything that happened. This is something that my sister and I talk about whenever we see each other. If only our parents would have known that we survived and that we had today 71 descendants of our family.
Wow. You're on this train, you say goodbye to your mom and dad for the last time. Your sister has already previously left. Your timeline now.
The first camp I was in was a labor camp. We went to potato harvest at an estate near Berlin. From there, we went into the woods and we cut woods down. I spent the next 2-3 years in forced labor camps. There were no people, nobody was killed. You had food, but at the end of the evening, you were surrounded by wire. There was no more freedom. Then you had to wear the yellow star. And the last camp I was in before I was sent to a place that all of you heard of, a place called Auschwitz. I was in a town where we cleaned sewers, you know, underground. And on February 28th, and those dates I remember, our whole camp was evacuated for 4 days and 5 nights in cattle cars until we arrived in a place called Auschwitz. I had never heard the name. I never knew what it meant, but that was the beginning of, I would imagine, in history, the lowest point that human beings can fall to.
Pause just 1 second. We are now at Auschwitz, and in reading your book, you have an encounter with Dr. Mengele. If you had to close your eyes, how would you describe him?
We arrived in Auschwitz on March 3rd, 43. You all seen pictures of the tracks and that low building in the background. We did not know what Auschwitz meant. I'd never heard of it. I know people had been deported to the east, but we thought they were some labor camp like the camps I was in. When I arrived, they beat us out of the cars, out of the cattle cars, and I noticed there was a particular smell in the air. Couldn't figure out what it was, a sweet smell. But we didn't know what's happening. We're beating out luggage left behind, men in one row, women on the other row, and we came by a man that I'd only later learned was Dr. Mengele, the death doctor in Auschwitz. And he went like this, as people walked by. If you were between the ages of 16 and 25, the thumb went up. For everybody else, including all women, every single woman was immediately sent, what we later on learned, were the gas chambers. We didn't know what it was. The ones with me, the thumb went up, and I was sent to the right and put on a truck. We sent to another place, part of Auschwitz, called Auschwitz-Buna, Birkenau. And as we got on the truck, there was some guy in blue and white striped, you know, you've seen all these pictures of what we wore during that time. And he said, "You are the lucky ones. Die anderen sind schon rauf im Kamin. The others are already up the chimney." That's when we realized this was not another work camp. This was an extermination camp. And Auschwitz has become known throughout the world and forever in history as the only time that a government of a Western country, a civilized country, built a camp to gas people to death. Never happened before, and God willing, something like this will never happen again.
That wasn't the only time your paths crossed with Dr. Mengele.
No, there was another incident. Let me come back to what I touched on before, when my father told me to take calligraphy lessons. I worked in the factory, like everybody else did, for several months, until you went down to about 80 or 90 pounds. The Germans had figured out scientifically that if you get a minimum of food, it'll take 4 to 6 months before your body gives out. I had reached that point. I was hit over the head by an SS man for whatever reason. There was no reason. It began to pus, and I went to the infirmary of Auschwitz, of that camp, to get it taken care of, because you didn't want to stay in the infirmary. because the infirmary was the way to the gas chamber. So I wanted to have it taken care of, and I sit there waiting until somebody can help me with it. And in comes a well-dressed inmate, striped clothing with around the arm, indicating he was an official of some kind. And he said, "Anybody here has a good handwriting?" And I raised my hand because, you know, calligraphy, I didn't know how to write. He says, "Come over here." Took me to the next room. He says, "Write. Körperschwäche," that means weak of body. Herzanschlag, heart attack. Yeah? So I asked him, "Go write." So I sit down and I write, and I still remember how to do calligraphy. He said, "Where'd you learn that?" "Well, I learned calligraphy." He says, "You'll do. Go over here and sit down and write. Next to the number," you see, I have the number on my arm. Nobody died of being gassed. They all died of weak of body and heart attack. And that's what I had to write next to each number of those who were sent away to the gas chamber. German efficiency. Nobody died that way. So that's how I saved my life. Stefan Heimann is his name. He was a communist. He served in the camps for probably since the early 1930s. He eventually became, after the war was over, the first interior minister of the East German government. And I owe my life to that man. Without him, I would not be here. To come back to your question about Mengele. Eventually, after I became a writer and a reporter, recorder, not a reporter, I became a medical aide in the infirmary. The infirmary was a way station to the gas chamber. That's all it was. But we had to take care of those who came with injuries to the foot or to the hand. So if there was a chance, I'd tell them, "Get out as quickly as you can," because nobody stayed more than a few days. So then I had that same band around me, and I became a medical aide. And one day we were told to go to one of the barracks in the infirmary. And there we were told, a truck coming with 5 or 6 women. And you don't ask any questions. So they came, and there were 5 women, one a young girl, not more than 16, 17 years old, by the name of Diane. I remember the name. She was forced to take little kids to the gas chamber, and she broke down. And she lost her, she lost it. And Mengele conducted medical experiments about electric shock, which is also used or has been used all over to bring people back to. But there it was different because they went to electric shock as far as they could before the person was killed. And we stood on the outside, but I saw that same man who went up when he arrived in Auschwitz. That was Dr. Mengele, who conducted the medical experiments. As people know, he drowned. He eventually went to South America. He was taken there through whatever help he was able to get. He was in hiding in Brazil. And from what we learned, he was drowned eventually he drowned himself in an accident, but he survived, and it was not until the 1950s or 60s that he died.
At some point while you're at Auschwitz, you know the Russians, at least maybe you didn't know, the Russians were coming, and there's this march out of Auschwitz. That's a question, I guess. Did you have a sense that things were happening in the camp?
We worked in the factory, and word got around that Germany was losing the war. In early 1945, the Russians were coming in from the east, moving towards Poland and into Germany. Auschwitz was in Poland. Oswiecim, it's called in Poland, in Polish. And we were wondering what's going to happen. We had no idea what was going to happen. Altogether, in the 3 camps which were Auschwitz, there were 60,000 inmates. Now, if I can tell you one thing, and that's something that stays with me. Life expectancy was 4 to 6 months. After that, gas chambers. Yeah? We didn't have, the only thing we had other than our clothing was a bowl for the soup that we got. Without that bowl, we were dead. I never had a towel. I wore the same pants and jacket for 2 years. We had lice. I eventually developed typhoid fever. And you knew sooner or later something, you're going to go. You knew it. Until today, I will not understand how I was able to survive. I can't. There's no explanation for it. The Russians were moving in. On April 17th, the announcement was made that the camp will be evacuated and all inmates will march towards the west, eventually to Germany. It was a bitter, cold winter, January 1945. 60,000 men and women in our clothing walking through the Polish countryside. Took hours for everybody to walk by. And I remember seeing in the windows when we walked through the streets, the Poles standing aghast as to the spectacle of seeing 60,000 people walking through the march. In the bitter winter of 1945. We walked for 2 days and 2 nights, and eventually wound up in Buchenwald, one of the major German camp in Germany. And from there, I was evacuated to a camp called Balga. And there, on April 18th, 2 friends and myself escaped and found our way to freedom.
This is Felix
and Hanso.
Hanso.
We were together the whole time.
What happened to those 2?
Hanso died of a heart attack about 5 or 6 years ago. Felix is still living. He didn't die, but he doesn't remember what happened. I was able to see him once. Amy was with me, and he came and wanted to shake my hand, and I wanted to hug him, you know. He had no recollection of what happened. Could not deal with it, and never married, never had a job, lives in a place called Port Matilda, Pennsylvania. I don't think anybody, a little village someplace. He survived, but I've never been in touch with him because to him the memory is not there. It's gone.
You escaped, hid and worked at a farm. The war ends. I'm going to fast forward a little bit of this here because I know you'll be talking about this tomorrow. And you go back to Mannheim and sort of see what happened and learn more about what happened to your family and to your property. Then you get a job with Dana, and then.
But that we'll talk tomorrow.
We'll talk about it. I'm just sort of working my way through it. and ultimately find yourself at the Nuremberg trial. And again, I know we're going to talk tomorrow, so this is the fast forward, folks. Go through this. You then find yourself in Port Huron, Michigan. How did that happen?
I must admit, Greg, and you've mentioned it to me any number of times, and I must admit, I've had an unbelievable life. I mean, I can't explain it. It's just the way things happen to me, you know? After the Nuremberg trial, the Nuremberg trial ended in August, July or August of 1946. The sentences were pronounced in September, and the 11 of them were hung in October. Yeah? I had left Germany in July 1946. Dana, the German news agency who liked my writing, offered me a job at age 23 as head of the Dana office in Berlin, but I could not stay in Germany. I felt it was impossible for me as a Jew to live in the country that had killed 6 million of our people and my family, took my education, my youth, everything away. So I came to the United States in July 1946. And you have to keep in mind, and I'm sort of saying this as I look at you, what was I going to do? I had no education, I had no profession, I had no money, I had no family, and come to the United States, what do I want to do with my life? And I decided, having been at the Nuremberg trial, I would be able to get any job in the United States as a reporter. I lived in Chicago at that time. That's another story, which is in the book. I went from one newspaper to another, and they all looked at me if I was crazy. You don't speak English. I spoke broken English. How can you become a reporter? Where are you born? Where you come from? Oh, come on, you must be joking. Until one man, Mims Thomason is his name, I still remember it. Things I don't forget whom I saw last week, and I don't remember some of you by name, but Mims Thomason I remember. He was the head of the UP, United Press in Chicago. I ran into his office and I said, I'm not going to walk here, I want to tell you who I am. And he was the first one who listened to me. He said, you were in one of the camps? I said, yes. You have the number? Yeah, I have the number. What are you going to do? I want to become a newspaperman. I like writing. He says, well, you can't become a newspaperman. You don't speak English. You have to learn you have to learn the language. You have to learn about this country. He says, I know a newspaper in Port Huron, Michigan. Have you heard of Port Huron? I know the owner of the newspaper in Port Huron. I'm going to give you a letter. You go there, I'm sure he'll give you a job. I said, you think I can? Yes. But the last $2 that I had left were given me by UJA, incidentally, that's how it worked. I went to Port Huron, Michigan. Never heard of the town before. I get there at night and I go to the newspaper's closed. In the evening, it's a small town newspaper. So I spent the night at the Greyhound bus station. The next morning I go to the paper. I said, I want to see the publisher, Mr. Weil. So there it's easy to get to see the owner of a paper. He looks at me and says, what you got? So I have a letter for you from Mims Thomason. He didn't write the letter. So he looks at the letter. He said, what do you want to do here? Said, well, I want to get a job. I want to become a reporter. But you don't speak English. You don't know anything about, have you ever heard of Port Huron? Never heard of it until 2 days ago. So I'll tell you what. You came all the way, I can't send you away, I'm going to give you a job. You become a copy boy. You know, we'll take papers from one to another desk, and I pay you $25 a week. $25 a week? God, that's real money. American money. So I started as a copy boy at the Port Huron Times-Herald. And that was the beginning of the difficult relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War was just beginning to start. You all know this from history. That was 1946, 47. And I wrote a column. I wrote a report to send it to the owner of the paper. He says, I want to tell you, there's been so much horror and so much war. Why do people kill each other? I know Russians, they're just as good as any American that I've met. I met them in the camp. They were treated the same way we were. Why does there have to be this kind of now a Cold War? And I sent it to the publisher in my bad English. Now the publisher writes a weekly column. In a small town, a newspaper owner has a right to make a weekly column. So what does he do? He, word for word, wrote about a young boy who came to Port Huron, who was in a concentration camp. And this is what he wrote about Russia and the United States. Published it in the Sunday paper. The next morning, I get a phone call from a student at the Port Huron Junior College. He said, we read the column of Mr. Weil, the publisher of the paper. And I understand you were in, he said a little bit about me, who I am. We have a club, a foreign relations club at the college. We're about 10, 15 people. We sit around a table. Would you be willing to tell us a little bit about Nuremberg, about what happened, about you, and so forth? He says, well, I don't speak English too well. Well, you talk, all right, we'll be glad to listen to you. So he talked me into it. For 2 or 3 days later, am I talking too long?
You're wonderful.
The guy picks me up, the one who had called me. He says, well, I have to explain something to you. We announced that the person who wrote, about whom Mr. Weil wrote in the column, was going to speak at the Foreign Relations Club. And everybody wants to hear what you have to say. They all read the paper in a small town. I get in there are 300-400 American youngsters. I had never spoken in my life, not German, not English, nothing. And here I am, it chooses me. That's the guy whose column, who wrote about, and here he is. I could have dropped into a hole, would have been easier for me. Never spoken before. I spoke for an hour and a half until I couldn't talk anymore. They walked out. There was not a word said. Nobody applauded. I talked about what happened to me. I talked about Kristallnacht, about Auschwitz, about Nuremberg, about what happened to me until I ran, because I'd never done that before. My broken English, I didn't give a damn. I spoke. Then he took me back home the next morning. The publisher called me into his office. They're going to fire me. Yeah? He says, I heard you spoke there at junior college. I said, yes, I did. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm a member of the Rotary Club. Yeah? And I'd like to invite you to speak to our next meeting, but I'm telling you, not an hour and a half. You got 20 minutes. That began a speaking career until today. I talk about simply what happened to me. Because all the things that happened to me, Hitler, the deportation, the camps, Auschwitz, the gas chamber, there are not too many people around who can talk about it. And I have forgive me for putting it this way, I have given to me by, I don't know who, the ability to communicate and put it in ways that people don't get embarrassed about it, but understand it, because it's a life of one individual. And I've been doing this all my career. And I have enjoyed every opportunity. And when you asked me to go to Bowling Green, it was because of what you said to me that I agreed to do it. You interviewed me there. This is our second or third or fourth interview. And from now on, I'm going to charge you. And at Bowling Green, you asked me, would you come and speak sometime at the Robert Jackson Institute? I'd heard of the Robert Jackson Institute, of course, who had not? And I'd known him. I'm probably one of the few people alive. And I'll talk about that tomorrow. That'll be different from what we're talking about today. And this has been a big part of my career and a big part of my life.
Interestingly enough, tomorrow a good part of the crowd will be people from the Jamestown Rotary. So extraordinary cycle. Excuse me.
My wife gives me a thing.
Yeah, go ahead and drop a couple names and then we'll wrap this up. Yep.
I love this.
I know what you're going through. My wife's doing the same thing to me now. So. Harpo Marx.
Oh, God. As part of my career for the United Jewish Appeal, I worked in Los Angeles, and one of the divisions that I dealt with was the motion picture industry. And one day we had a big meeting, and I got his agent on the phone, and I said, I'm Ernest Michel from UJA, and I'd like to know, would Harpo Marx be willing to come to a meeting? He says, you're nuts. He wouldn't do that. He doesn't speak. He says, well, everybody knows who he is, and I know he's Jewish, and I think he would be interested in doing it. He says, well, I'll let you talk to him yourself. So he put me on the phone, and there was Harpo. His name was Arthur. Groucho was the, Groucho, Harpo, it's that Harpo. He says, what do you want me to do? He says, well, I'll be glad to come, but I will not speak. Well, I said, whatever you want to do, it's all right, as long as I can say Harpo Marx is coming, So he agreed to come. And out of this developed a friendship with an unusual and a wonderful human being, Harpo Marx, whom I got to know. My children met him. He took a picture with them on the harp with them. Lived in Palm Springs, California. And it was one of the little incidents that happened that sort of added to all the things that happened to me during my career.
Jack Benny.
Different. Jack Benny was one of the most generous men in Hollywood. He's known as a generous man. I got to know him. He appeared for UJA, and he was part of it, and he died many, many years ago, but he was the opposite of what appeared to be a part of his show. He was a wonderful guy.
To tie up a couple of loose ends here, Lottie, it's an interesting story how your sister finally knew that you were still alive.
Yeah, that happened in Nuremberg. The question that Greg asks is, how did I know about my sister? He says, I didn't know about my sister. When I came to Mannheim after the war, I was under the impression that there was nobody in my family who had survived. And I understood it, because the death rate was 6 million. We were 18 million Jews in the world, 6 million, 1 out of 3 were killed by the Nazis. So one day when I worked at the military government, which was the first real job I had in Mannheim, the lieutenant, who meant a great deal to me and became a close friend of mine, by the name of Albert Huttler. He was a lieutenant in the American Army in charge of the displaced persons section in the area of Mannheim, because there were 12 to 15 million foreign laborers that Hitler had brought into Germany from France, Belgium, Holland, from all over Europe. And they had to be repatriated. And that was his job, and I helped him to be an interpreter during that time. He called me in, he said, look, there is a man here, has an envelope for you. I said, what do you mean, envelope? Nobody knows I'm here. He has an envelope. And the guy stood up and says, yes, he wore a uniform with a Mogen David, the Jewish star. He says, are you Ernest Michel? I says, yes. I have an envelope for you. Like, this can't be. Nobody knows. I'm all alone. Ernest Michel Mannheim. So open it up. He had a stack of envelopes like that. There's a letter written by my sister to Ernest Michel Mannheim, without nothing addressed. And I have been given the task to take these letters all over Germany. People trying to find relatives. Lieber Ernst, dear Ernst, I don't know whether this letter reaches you. I don't even know whether you are alive. But I am in Palestine, in a kibbutz. It is now, this was 45, 46, before Israel was declared a state. When it was still Palestine, eventually it was divided between, well, that's a whole different story. And that's how I found out that my sister was alive. She was kept by Catholic nuns, I mentioned that before, in a convent, and that's how she saved her life.
You have recently been interviewed by BBC, Adam Levy, and I think...
How do you know that?
Because Adam Levy called me, and he said he wanted to know who were interesting people, and I said there's the most singular guy named Ernest Michel.
So you were the one.
Nope. I don't want any royalties. I don't want any... As of right now, we're even.
Greg, I'll give you 50% of what I got.
Well, anyways, you will soon see on television. I think it just aired.
It will be shown, I think. I don't know when it was shown.
Yeah.
It may have been shown already all over. I don't know it.
It was BBC, so he's a star. And I also saw you on Nightline.
Yeah.
Not so long ago. You're going back to Auschwitz.
Right.
With your family.
Right.
And an extremely emotional.
Yeah.
Meeting. As I'm running out of time, and I'm looking over Amy over my shoulder here, but I want to. One thing, it just sort of languishes out there, and I want to give you just a chance to reflect on it, because it may not have a chance to talk about it today. Your granddaughter, you mentioned, is in the Israeli army. Obviously, that's been what's going on in the Middle East has been heavy in the news right now. But your life work at the United Jewish Appeal has certainly been much to assist the state of Israel. What's your sense of all this?
Greg, I'm an optimist. Yeah, otherwise I wouldn't have survived. What's going on right now, to me, affects me emotionally, personally, as a Jew, and also as an American. I'll talk more about that tomorrow when we talk about genocide and what the lessons of Nuremberg, what's the whole separate subject. Israel was born out of the ashes of the Holocaust. Yeah? It became a nation because of the guilt of the Western world to have let happen in Germany what eventually happened. Very simply said, there was a guilt feeling among the leaders of the major governments at that time, including Harry Truman, including Stalin, including leaders of many of the countries who felt that 6 million people were killed because they were Jewish, and therefore they felt that something had to be done. And in came a man by the name of Ben-Gurion, who is one of the great names in all of Jewish history, and created the Jewish state. That state is in the center of the Arab world. And I'm trying to be objective about it, and yet I have, and I'm sure everybody here will understand that, a personal feeling about what's happening. It is one of the most unsoluble situations in the world today. Has been since 1948, since the State of Israel was created, for one simple reason: anti-Semitism, and the feeling that a Jewish state has no place in the Middle East, despite the fact that it's the birthplace of the Jewish people. And many Christians believe in that, as we do. Israel is surrounded. There are about 5 to 6 million Jews living in Israel today, by a Muslim world that's today 1.2 billion. The area around Israel is 500 times the area that Israel has. You know, it's like Rhode Island. The Palestinians, whom I have a great deal of sympathy for, as I say, I try to be objective about it, feel that the Jews do not belong here. The Prime Minister, the President of Iran, everybody knows that, makes a statement: Israel must be wiped off the face of the earth. A member nation of the United Nations. The Hamas will not recognize the existence of the State of Israel. There is no other state in the United Nations. They may have differences. They may be fighting each other. But they don't say you don't exist. It's an insoluble situation. And I happen to believe, and this may not be the right way to end this kind of an interview, that we, Western civilization today, is facing a belief of a religious group that wants to destroy our Western way of life. Yeah? I happen to believe, and I'm an optimist, and I think something is going to happen to reverse it. But they want to, and the number 2 man of, and I don't know whether some of you have heard it or read it, said, every American has to become an Islam. Otherwise, have you read it? Yeah? Every American has to be changed to the Islam. If not, the consequences will be something that you will never believe. Do they mean it? I don't know. I think we are strong enough in order to be able to overcome it. And being an optimist that I am, I believe that some solution not will be found, but must be found. Otherwise, we will live in a different world than we live today.
Thank you, Ernest Michel. Wow.
Thank you very much. Greg, you're quite a guy.
Thank you. Thank you. It's terrific. Get this off of here.
Yes, you can take it off. Too long, Amy?
No, it's wonderful.
He's wonderful. He's terrific. You
He's
really
so
are.
smart. He knows what he's doing.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Take care. We're very, very lucky. We have the home to talk about.
That's my husband.